So it's my pleasure to introduce Al Hunter, who is a local author and historian. He's written several books about Indianapolis, and for the last 12 years he's been conducting ghost tours of Irvington in my neighborhood. And I gotta tell you, the tours are about 75% history, about 25% ghost stories and folklore, and 100% fun. So I really recommend them. And they all raise funds for the East Side, for Irvington, and for the Irvington homeless shelter. So Tim and Al, why don't you come up here and tell us some stories? Your mouse, I'll let you figure out. Yeah, I'm gonna let you do it, right? I'm a Luddite, remember?
I hear you.
That's there if you want it.
How did you advance that?
I used my device. Once you told me how to work it.
Just to use the arrows?
Yeah.
Let's see if it works. Woohoo! As Steve said, my name's Al Hunter. I've written a few books. I write for the weekly View newspaper that's out of Irvington. I've done that for quite some time now. And generally, I write about things that pop culturists, folklore, ghost stories, things. I just try to pick out things that interest me and just hope that they interest somebody else. So the ghost tours, as Steve said, are all for fun and all for the good of the East Side. We're very proud of that. They are kid-friendly. They are heavy in history. And in fact, I tell people that even though I've been a paranormal investigator for 20 years, I leave all my paranormal heavy lifting to that man, Tim Pointer. He does that and his fine people that work with him. My job has always been to try and figure out why the hauntings, the ghosts that these folks are picking up are there. Is there an explanation for them? A lot of times there is, sometimes there's just not. And most times they're picking up on things that all they want me to do is confirm. And that's how this project came together. Steve contacted us, and I was amazed because it was a delicious email. It said "Ghost in the State Library" was the header. So of course I'm going to open up that. And when he asked us to come out here and talk about ghosts, I was shocked because it's been my experience that government, state, local, or national do not believe in ghosts. They don't want to talk about ghosts, and they do not believe in them. So the opportunity to come here was a special one, and we took advantage of it. We spent several afternoons here working and doing things separately. Generally, Tim will come up with what he comes up with these good people here, and then I will try and answer their questions through the archives at the ISL. My presentation will be a little bit redundant. Steve's covered some of that, which doesn't surprise me because he's pretty much the man when it comes to the history of this place. My job is to try to spook it up a little. So they asked me to explain a little bit about the ghosts that might have inhabited Indianapolis before the state library was here. And I spent a little time on that, but I didn't spend a whole lot of time on it because there was so much going on in this building. I can tell you that this area that you're at, all of it was Delaware Indian land. If you look at a map of where the tribes were settled, like here, the stars represent the Delawares. So there are centuries and centuries of history before white men ever came to here, right here in Indianapolis. The Delawares, what intrigued me about them is they believed strongly in life after death, and it was their practice to bury their dead in very, very shallow graves. So literally, we as paranormal enthusiasts and ghost hunters, you know, the thought of a dead body just below your feet always intrigues us and makes us start thinking about, well, maybe they're still here. The first settlers in this area would have been fur traders, missionary soldiers, trappers. And that would go on until about 1818's Treaty of St. Mary's pretty much pushed the Indians out of here, and the white men started settling here. Now, part of my presentation is I'm going to read a couple things that I've written because the work's already done, and it's easier for me to read it than to freewheel it. So I would ask you to just kind of open your mind and put yourself back in 1819. George Pogue is an irresistible figure to me. Some of you probably recognize the name. If you don't recognize the name George Pogue, you certainly recognize Pogue's Run, which was a popular waterway in Indianapolis. But I'll read to you from an excerpt from one of my articles. George Pogue, a 54-year-old Carolina blacksmith, had no idea he was making history when, on March 2, 1819, he settled on a hill overlooking a stream that connected to the White River a short distance away. George had simply followed a trail blazed by Native American Indians and wildlife through the wilderness made long before him. Pogue is widely regarded as the first white settler in Indianapolis. As more and more white settlers arrived in the area in the months to follow, the shallow waterway became known as Pogue's Run. The waterway that bears his name is as mysterious as the man himself. Some historians argue that Pogue simply moved into an existing cabin that had been built and briefly occupied by Newton Ute Perkins. Others claim that John Wesley McCormick accompanied Pogue to Indianapolis from Connersville and deserves to be mentioned as the first settler in the capital city. But Perkins moved to Rushville on account of loneliness, and McCormick settled near Bloomington, where he later had a popular state park named in his honor. But for this historian, George Pogue is the man. Why? Because one day George Pogue simply vanished from the face of the earth. Whether Pogue was the first settler, the first white man to settle here or not, he was certainly the first white man to die here. According to one contemporary account, George Pogue was a large, broad-shouldered, stout man with dark hair and eyes and complexion. His appearance was that of a Pennsylvania Dutchman. Colorless, functional clothing with no ornamentation, a broad-brimmed felt hat, and a mustache-less beard stretching from ear to ear. One look at George Pogue would make anyone think twice about challenging him. He was one of the few in the area unafraid of the indigenous Delaware warriors that roamed the woods encircling them. One evening at twilight, an Indian brave known as Wyandotte John stopped at the Pogue family cabin, asking for food and shelter for the night. Although wary of the request, some of Pogue's horses had been recently stolen, and he was determined to track down the thieves. The Indian had a bad reputation, and the rumor was that he had been banished from his own tribe in Ohio for some unknown offense and was now wandering aimlessly among the various Indian tribes in the area. Wyandotte John had spent the previous winter living rough but comfortably in a hollowed-out sycamore log perched under a bluff just east of the area that, a decade later, would become the spot where the National Road Bridge crossed the White River. On the inside of his log, he had fashioned hooks by cutting forks from tree limbs on which he rested his gun. At the open end of the log, near the waterline, he built his fire, which kept the wildlife away while heating the enclosure at the same time. After Wyandotte John was fed, Pogue, aware that his guest was known to travel from one Indian camp to another, asked him if he had seen any white man's horses at any of the camps. The Indian brave said he had left a camp of Delawares that morning, about 12 miles east, at a settlement on nearby Buck Creek, present-day Southeastern Avenue, where he had seen horses with iron hoofs, indicating that they had been shod. Wyandotte John's description of the horses led the blacksmiths to believe that these were the missing mounts. However, George Pogue was nobody's fool. He began to think that Wyandotte John had described the horses so accurately that it might be a ploy to lure the blacksmith into the woods. He shared his suspicions with his family, who begged him to let the matter go. George Pogue was not that kind of a man. When the Indian left the next morning, Pogue grabbed his gun and his dog and followed as Wyandotte John walked towards the river and the pioneer settlement. Pogue followed for some distance, waiting for the Indian to turn towards the native camps, but the Indian kept walking towards the white settlers. The two men disappeared over a rise, and George Pogue was never seen or heard from again. The settlers formed a company of armed men to search all the Indian camps within 50 miles of the settlement, looking for some trace of Pogue, but his fate remains a mystery to this day. The conclusion is that he was killed by Indians. Locals claim to have seen his horse and several of his possessions in the hands of local tribes. The dog was purportedly killed, cooked, and eaten, which I know makes my wife cringe. That's why I left that in there. What's interesting to me is, and to show you what a legend this man became, a few years ago you might remember they dug up bones not far from the state library, and they knew these bones to be considered ancient, and they knew them to be a white man. They speculated that it was George Pogue. So he would have rambled this area. I'm sure he trod the fields underneath where we're sitting right now for many a day. He haunts the area, which is cool about him. And in our research, we find that sometimes everybody equates ghosts with the building or with the house. Sometimes you don't need that. Sometimes they wander from place to place to place. And there's stories all over the city, all over the state of ghosts that will migrate from building to building to building. And people will call Tim and say, will you get him out? Tim's answer is generally is, yeah, I can get him out of here, but he's going to come back, because they wander. And George Pogue is one of those spirits. I love these photos, just to give a history of the area, to give an idea. People forget what Indiana must have looked like. It was the western frontier, and you can see that it's basically the roads. The national road would have been just a dirt path with the stumps cut down low enough for the wagons to get past. This is one of the earliest maps of Indianapolis. Shows Pogue's Run on there. That's the only waterway that is listed. That's how important he was to the 1821 plat of what they called the town of Indianapolis. Here's a modern day map of Indianapolis, and this becomes important to me. You see the circle in the center. There's the state library. There's Monument Circle, Indiana War Memorial, and Indiana Avenue. Now, as a paranormal enthusiast / researcher, what we find is, according to even the state library's own literature, the library is located near center of a triangle between Indiana Avenue, War Memorial Plaza, and Monument Circle. Everybody over here that's in the first rows understands why I'm bringing that up. Triangles play a big part in what we do. They can go either way. They can either, to a paranormal researcher, it is a symbol of power, it is a symbol of energy. To others, it's a symbol of the Holy Trinity. And of course, you know what the Holy Trinity is: Father, Son. This is a ghost talk. Holy Ghost. Holy Ghost. Holy Spirit will not work. And what's interesting to me is that if you look up, let's go back to that real quick. If you look up and Google it, you'll see that according to ancient beliefs, an upright equilateral triangle with the point at the top and two at the base is a male and solar symbol representing spirit, divinity, fire, life, prosperity, and harmony. In contrast, the reverse triangle is a female and lunar, representing Mother Earth, water, rain, and grace. So depending on whether you live in Carmel or Greenwood, you're either leaning towards a man or you're leaning towards a woman. I put this in there just for a self-serving purpose. That's the old State House, and I am a Lincoln fan, and like most people in this room, and it never ceases to amaze me that I just got to believe that this building has some residual connection to that State House where Lincoln, where his body was put on display on April 30th, 1865. So that really has nothing to do with my presentation. I just wanted to thrill you with it. The area surrounding the State House, as Steve touched on, was most often populated by retail shops, taverns, hotels, dance halls, and theaters. Radiating outward would become the gamblers, the thugs, the criminals of the area. Factories, large and small, populated, working conditions less than ideal. No child labor laws. It was long, arduous days. 8-hour days were non-existent back then. And on the Sanborn maps, along with listing the occupations of many of the former residents of this property as prostitutes, they also listed some of the buildings as tenements. Tenements is almost like a fictional word to us. It's something that denotes something terribly bad, but back then, how bad would you have to be to have your building called a tenement? Much of the land where the State Library is was overcrowded apartments that were tenements. They housed the poor, generally 8 to 10 people in a room that would suit maybe 2 people. And of course, the streets were full of runaways and orphans sleeping in the stairways, under the bridges, wherever they could go. Gambling halls would have proliferated this area all over the place. And I prefer to think that they were there because the state legislators were here. So. Prostitution was listed as an occupation, and Tim and I discussed how amazed we were to look at the old census records and see these names with their occupation listed as prostitute in the late 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. It was not respectable, but it was recognized. And I just threw gratuitous pictures of prostitutes in there. And of course, with prostitution, despair, incarceration would have been in its wake. I love this part. This is the fortune-telling part, is from my collection. That was Evelyn Fay. She was a psychic and a palmist, and her parlor, so to speak, in the 1890s was located exactly where the Indiana War Memorial, part of our Mystic Triangle, would have been housed. And of course, I love the old propaganda poster that would have been issued on the telephone poles and fences around this area from the Indiana State Board of Health. It reads, if you can't read it, "I am death. Too early join me, breathe much foul air, drink alcoholic liquors, eat midnight suppers, eat lots of rich food, bolt your food, or wash it down with large amounts of black coffee, and neglect your bowels." I tried to find some pictures that would illustrate what this area would have looked like before the library came to town. It was very difficult. I found these images that had been taken from the top of the Natural Surgical Institute in the area. It would have been on the right side of these images. The round building to the right fascinates me because this is about 1890, 1895. That housed a cyclorama painting of the Battle of Atlanta. Indianapolis was a huge area. In fact, it was headquarters for the GAR up until it dissolved. So that was built specifically to attract Civil War veterans. It might be considered the King's Island of the Civil War veterans. And of course, the area became home to the traction terminal. You can see it here. And soon the Greyhound bus terminal, you can actually see the library back there, would take its place. Love these photos. Steve has used them in his presentations before. They're irresistible to me, and they were irresistible to Tim and I, because we are looking for reasons as to account for why they're having these occurrences in the state library. Well, a lot of it goes back to the property. A lot of it goes back to the days before this building was ever here. Now, some of the activity is definitely connected to the people and that have populated and worked this building. But if you look at this picture, that they're building what Steve described as the stacks in this picture, and you can see the workmen just watching and looking down at that hole. The next picture, there's an undeniable symbolism of graves in this picture. As you look at it, you can see the workmen acting like grave diggers right in the center, underneath where the state library is, where the stacks are today. That's an unmistakable symbolism to us. And of course, the skeleton of the library, October of 1932, that began to creep up the sides. By November, you can see that the limestone facade is starting to creep up the torso. See, it's my job to put this in kind of creepy form. By January 33, the library is ready to receive her crown. And by February of 1933, the Indiana State Library is ready to receive and greet visitors with a toothy smile crafted of Indiana lifestyle. Full of books, documents Furniture and Ghosts in February of 1932, or 34, was it? Steve used this, and what I was hoping, I didn't see his, we met at the Oriental Inn on the east side, and I saw his mock-up of the book, and I was disappointed because I had seen this picture in the ISL archives, and I was hoping against hope that you were going to recreate this picture. Where are you? Why is that not you standing there looking at your favorite relief? And there's a close-up from Steve's book of the relief that he was talking about, which is shocking. When he told me that, that's incredibly shocking. And how it's gone unnoticed and how it's not raised controversy over the years is beyond me. But we'll just forget we ever saw that. As we're going through the pictures downstairs, the ISL files are full of pictures from its beginning all the way up to present day. And you start looking for things that stand out in your mind as a paranormal researcher. And I found a series of photos, 8 by 10, that'd been printed off, numbered consecutively, of the stacks in the lower regions of this building. And it's, as you notice, number 15, 16 consecutive pictures, just general pictures of the stacks taken in the 1970s. And then number 18 is of a book that has been pulled out and is resting by itself on the floor. And number 18, they've gone back and they've taken a picture of the librarian working there with Dillinger Days highlighted. Now, where my mind goes is, why did someone take number 17? Why is that picture there? I'm sure there have been many books piled on the floors of the library in its history here. Some reason this photographer took that picture. And for us, keep in mind, for a paranormal researcher, there are very little subjectives in our field. For us, they had to have taken that because it either fell out or was not there 5 minutes before he took his series of pictures. Regardless of what you believe, you have to wonder why that picture of a disembodied book is on the floor and why it was taken in the first place. See, I use that language all the time. There was a funny incident when we started this in the rare books and manuscript room. My job again was to go pour through the papers while these good folks did their job. And before you leave today, I brought a bunch of copies of the Weekly View newspaper that has this man's picture in it, and it discusses these good people here and the project that we had going on. So pick up one of those, and it tells the story in detail. But Bethany is the supervisor of that room, and she accommodated by bringing out volumes of letters and photos, which I pored over all day as Tim and his group walked around the building and gathered in their information. That means it wants me to read. So I will read to you a couple paragraphs from that article to explain it better. The State Library investigation presented itself in the form of an alluring puzzle, partially assembled, but lacking the key pieces necessary to form a more complete picture. My job on this project was to objectively gather the encounter stories of past and present employees and, together with the findings of Tim and his group of intuitives, try and determine who or what may be responsible for them. As a devotee of Indiana history, ghost stories, and folklore, I often find myself in this position whenever I investigate the reports of things that go bump in the night. Shameless plug for my column, by the way. On this particular occasion, sparks flew on our very first visit. I spent my time poring over documents, letters, and photographs dealing with the earliest days of the library and housed in the rare books and manuscripts room on the second floor. Room supervisor Bethany, Bethany Fitcher, see? Went above and beyond the scope of her official duties by digging up everything she could find about the library and placing it neatly at my disposal for research. My intuitive powers pale in comparison to those of Tim and his crew, but through deductive reasoning and sound research techniques, it is sometimes easier than not to discover who may be the source of a haunting. 2 men from the library's past immediately jumped out at me. Although I continued to peel back layers of history, searching for more people, events, and clues, I kept coming back to these 2 men. They quickly became the center of my investigation. While I researched, Tim spent his time walking around the library alongside his team of psychic intuitives, gathering their thoughts and feelings about the old library. Filming was done, audio recordings were made, and ghost hunting equipment was used, but in the end, it came down to their individual impressions that revealed the most about their subjects. The process was exhausting and required several follow-up trips to complete. On that first day of researching, I left earlier than Tim's team. I had spent the day veritably glued to one chair and table in the center of the research room, illuminated by a massive fluorescent light. After I left, Tim returned to the rare books and manuscripts room to find Bethany circling the area I had most recently vacated with a puzzled look on her face. It seems the lights above that particular table had suddenly and dramatically gone out. Bethany explained to Tim that the lights in the room were newly installed and updated quite recently, and she couldn't figure out what had caused the outage. Eventually, that single outage caused the entire bank of lights in the research room to go out. Tim just smiled and said, "That's the ghost." He continues, "This event struck me as being very synchronistic." That's a big word for you, Tim. Our research had just uncovered the people that are very likely the spirits that inhabit the ISL. This would be a classic example of a spirit manifestation right out of the movie Ghostbusters. This was to me a very dramatic demonstration how a spirit can affect an electrical system in a building. Steve talked about the old library in the State House and how it may have looked. Of course, that intrigued me. There's another view of it. And in my research, I came to this man, irresistible as he may be. This is Major Gordon Tanner. Some of you may have heard of him. Some of you may not have heard of him. He was the youngest state librarian in the history of the state library, unless that's changed recently. He cared about what he was doing. He was a brilliant man. He was a rising star in Indiana, but he was also a patriot, and he was brave. He was a brave man. He was born on July 19th, 1829, grew up in Bloomington, Indiana. He was, according to what I've read about him, was a man of imposing appearance and possessed great firmness and decision of character with noble qualities of head and heart. He was born for military service and greatness. His great-grandfather had been an officer in the Revolutionary War and had lost an arm at the Battle of Kings Mountain. Tanner was the eldest of 5 sons. At the age of 6, he could read and write with remarkable correctness. Now keep in mind, that's in 1835. That's quite an accomplishment. At the age of 13, he commenced a thorough preparation in the languages and mathematics for a college course. Keep in mind again, in the case of Butler College in Irvington, you only had to be 14 years old to go to college in the 1800s. Just as he was ready to enter the state university, his father died, and he was left at the age of 16 with the care and responsibility of providing for his mother's family. So in 1820, he was appointed colonel of the 17th Regiment, Indiana Militia, and held the commission until his death. When the war was declared against Mexico, he entered the Army, served in an Indiana company of volunteers. He caught malaria down in New Orleans, and he was confined to hospital for a couple months, but he did serve. At 25, he became the state librarian for a 2-year term, even though it was supposed to be a 3-year term. And along came the Civil War. He had gone from state librarian to recorder of the Supreme Court. And that might not sound much to you, but the person that was in front of him was Albert G. Porter, and his successor as Supreme Court recorder was Benjamin Harrison. Porter became one of our most active governors, and Harrison became Benjamin Harrison, little Ben, President of the United States. So this man was destined to do great things. He was appointed major of the 22nd Regiment of Indiana Volunteers in August of 1861. That regiment was ordered to Missouri. On September 18th, the 22nd, 26th, regiments were ordered up to the Missouri River towards Glasgow. This is an unusual battle. The Battle of Lexington was unusual because the Federals were housed in a fort, and the Confederates attacked the fort. That's very rarely found. It's just like an old John Wayne movie. You don't see that in the Civil War much. Losses might seem pretty light to you, 66 killed and 237 wounded, 8 missing. But that, you got to remember, this is 6 months after the war started, and this is the Western Theater. Those losses were staggering back then. The result of the battle was over 3,000 Union soldiers were taken prisoner. The Federals were released and sent home on the promise that they would not re-enlist. Their promise was ignored by the Army. The Army sent them right back to the front. At the Battle of Shiloh, many of them were recaptured. It was discovered that they had violated their oath, and they were shot to death, just doing their duty. Tanner was on horseback leading his men. He had gone to check on Company B, I believe it was, and made the mistake of writing between lines. This illuminated him in the moonlight, and even though the official records say that he was shot by a volley from the Confederates, it was really he died from friendly fire. He was killed by his own men. The battlefield, which I love stuff like this, being a relic guy, I love the idea that if you go to the Battle of Lexington site today in the courthouse is that cannonball in the top of the courthouse. And I love this battle because it was known as the Battle of the Hemp Bales. And people, when you're driving around through Indiana now, you see round bales all over the place, and you probably don't pay much attention to them. It's hard to believe that these were here in the Civil War. They were used, and what they did was the Confederates, like Sisyphus, they actually rolled the bales down and fired from behind the bales, but not before they soaked them with water to absorb the bullets. Can you imagine that? And in some places they stacked them too high. So just like a Roman battle, can you imagine? You're stuck in this fort in the valley, very bad position for a fort, and these guys are coming. You see hay bales rolling down the hills with gunfire coming from behind it. I love this part about Tanner. I think it's important that you listen to his words, what he said as librarian. I'll read you what I think are the most impassioned parts in his report to the legislature in 1854. He said, "The library is very defective in all departments, but it had but few first-rate books of any kind, and for the benefit of his successor," he said this as he was leaving, he urged that the salary be increased for its current salary, which had been established in 1846. He said the duties of the office were quadrupled, and that the necessities of life had doubled in price, with the consequence that the librarian, if he had a family, must starve or neglect the duties of his office to gain a living in some other pursuit. He offered no apology, failing to make a catalog, which was part of his job, as contemplated by law, because, in his words, he had to make a choice between two great evils, neglect of duty or starvation. My favorite quote to the legislature as he is leaving was, "To make even a tolerable librarian," listen closely, "one must have cultivated for many years a close intimacy with books. A man may make a good governor, an intelligent legislator, a competent judge, and yet be totally unfit for the duties of a librarian," meaning that the office requires peculiar talents, difficult of acquisition, and worthy of a liberal reward. When you need a raise, I'll give this to you. And what I found about, he was a lawyer. He had graduated from Indiana University Law School, and he was so passionate about the law library, he complained that there were volumes missing, and he used part of his meager salary to go buy them and replace them. And I think you can see in that last quote that back then, I think it was members of the clergy, state legislators, judges, and lawyers were the only ones that had access to the books. And you can tell by his pleas, he didn't like any of those guys. My next suspect, Steve talked about a little bit, was John Scott Williams. He was the first and most powerful one that jumped out at me. I just kept coming back to him and back to him and back to him. And what you do is, I don't have any information. Steve hasn't told me anything about what's been going on. Tim hasn't told me anything about what he's feeling, because he starts feeling stuff. He's like a Roman candle. He starts feeling stuff as soon as he walks in the door, and so do the rest of these people. I don't want to know that, because I don't want it to taint my research, and they don't want to know my research until they're done, because that will taint their findings. So I'm going through, looking through dozens and dozens of biographies of people that have worked at the State Library. And through deductive reasoning, you can figure out who the suspects might be to still be on the premises. And the two men that I deduced were the most likely suspects. I just told you the one that I felt strongly about. This is the one that I felt strongest about. This is John Scott Williams, a native Englishman. He is, in my opinion, the most compelling figure in the earliest development of the ISL. He's responsible for the artwork that you see around you. And what is interesting to me is the ISL has all of his letters, has all of his papers, and you can read from the beginning of the project to the end of the project, and you can see just by reading his letters how he felt about this project. And what I kept coming back to in all of his letters, he talks about the lead that he used in the stained glass. He talks about the lead not being thick enough, not strong enough, how he had to go through several different types of lead, Spanish lead, who even knew there was Spanish lead, English lead, German lead, and the glass being treated with acid, and how he would have to treat the glass 6, 7, 8 times to get it to where he wanted. And the reason that he used oil or lead paint instead of oil paint, because of the colors. He wanted the colors to stand out. But what you keep coming back to is, not only is he passionate about his work, he keeps talking about lead, and acid. Well, to me, I'm thinking immediately of the Mad Hatter and Alice in Wonderland. I know nothing about this man other than what I'm reading in his letters. So I had convinced myself by the end of that first day of researching that this man surely had died a gruesome, horrible death at the hands of lead and acid. And that was one of the reasons why he was still here. Nope, he did not. He died peacefully in his sleep in 1976. Although disappointed, it made me understand that sometimes it's not necessarily what happened to the person, what was the instrument of their demise, so much as it matters that what was he most interested in? What was his passion? This was his passion. He really didn't do much else after he left here. He pretty much falls off. He had other projects, but building up to this, he had done a bunch. After he left, he really didn't do a whole lot. In fact, his wife, who he mentions just in passing in his letters as his favorite illustrator, kind of treats her like a pack mule. She went on to become a much more famous artist than Williams. And what intrigued me about her was that she went on to be kind of the house artist and resident for Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. My wife and I go to Gettysburg 4 or 5 times a year. I'm a Civil War buff, and there again, I found some connection that straight to Gettysburg to me. So anybody that knows me knows that's a little freaky. What I found in the ISL collection about this guy that made me think he was the Mad Hatter is fully 2/3 of the pictures that you all have of him are out of focus. He's moving. He's frenetic. He can't stand still. And I don't know who took the pictures. I'm guessing it would have been Bass Photo, because Bass Photo was nearby, and I just have my suspicions that it was Bass Photo. All of you as historians are familiar with Bass Photos, and you know they do very good work. This is not what they would normally do. So I was surprised that they would be capturing him so out of focus, and you can see that in the images. So those were the two guys that I felt were so strongly attached to this building. And I will let Tim tell you what happened. I kept that information to myself that day and only shared it with him after you guys had done 6 or 7 hours worth of filming, research, and recording. And that'll give you an idea of how this kind of stuff goes together. You're on, Tim.